Hi friends, Jenny at Clover and Violet here, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to put a double fold binding on a quilt. I'm going to be using my mini spools quilt for the double fold binding, but usually I put single fold binding on mini quilts or mug rugs or other really small projects, and I save double fold binding, which is what most people refer to binding as. I just save that for a regular quilt, but I'm going to be showing you using this mini quilt exactly how to cut and assemble the binding and then attach it to your quilt. So let's head over to the cutting table and get started. Usually when I make a mini quilt, I do a single fold binding. And I showed you that technique in a different video. You can find the link in the description of this video. But for this quilt, I'm going to show you how to do a double fold binding. So we're going to start with our binding fabric. I'm actually going to use this black fabric. I think it will be a great contrast to the light, sweet prints of this quilt, and then this nice inky black. So I'm going to set my quilt aside. Oh, we do want to measure. So my quilt is 24 inches, and your typical fabric is 40 inches wide. So I know I'm going to need 2 strips of the binding just to get 80 inches. But my quilt being 24 by 24 by 24 by 24, I'm actually going to need a 3rd strip for this quilt. So that's kind of how you measure it, is how long is your binding need to be. You're going to measure around the perimeter of your quilt, divide that by 40 inches, and then make sure that you're going over 40 inches because you're going to lose some in the seam allowance, and you're also going to need your binding to overlap a little bit. So I'm going to cut 3 2.5-inch strips for this quilt. You may be wondering what the difference is between single and double fold binding. So the single fold binding that I previously showed in my other video, I cut 1.5-inch strips, and then I didn't fold my binding, hence the single fold. It's folded around the edge of your quilt one time. This binding I'm going to cut for double fold, and so I'm going to cut my binding and then fold it before I attach it to my quilt. So let's begin with cutting. Since I keep my fabric on these bolts and I have them for a long time, I'm just going to square up the edge of mine really quickly as well. So here I have 2.5 inches, and you can see I'm cutting a little bit beyond the 2.5-inch line for this first cut. I'm going to slide it aside and make a second 2.5-inch cut, and one more because I need 3 pieces for my quilt. And we'll set this aside. And then let's square up this piece right here that has a little bit of fold. And as much as I don't love squaring up my fabric from keeping it on the mini bolts of fabric, I actually do love having mini bolts of fabric because it allows me to see what I actually have for fabric. And a lot of times knowing what you have is half the battle to using your fabric. If your fabric is hidden in a tote under your bed, at least for me, I wouldn't remember what's in there. So to me, it's worth a little bit of fabric loss when the mini bolts are stuffed and pulled in and out to know what I have and to use what I have. So in case you're wondering, I think it's totally worth it. Different people have different methods that work great for them. So we're going to take our fabric, and the first thing we're going to do is trim off our selvage edges because those are not going to be included in our binding. So we'll just trim straight across. This particular fabric is about folded in the middle, and so I'm just going to trim through both layers. Sometimes, depending on how the fabric was put on the bolt, you'll have to trim each side individually. But I'll just trim this one both. 2, and one more. Okay, and then what we're gonna do is take these strips and we're gonna join them together. So you can join your strips one of two ways. You can either just sew them right sides together on the straight of the grain, and then your seam will just be straight when it wraps around your quilt. Or I'm going to sew mine at a 45-degree angle. So I'm gonna place my quilt pieces like this, and then I'm gonna sew along this diagonal line. You can draw it with a pencil if that helps you keep track of your line better. I'll just show you that. Just take our ruler. You only need to draw on one piece. This ruler actually has a 45-degree angle on it. You can see it right here. So when my 45-degree angle is here, my fabric is straight. And when I'm lining up on the 45-degree angle, my fabric is going right here. And then I know that this is a perfect 45-degree. I'm going to draw my little line, and then we'll place it right sides together with the other piece of fabric. And if you're at all confused how to place it, it's pretty simple when you think of it this way. So pin in the cutoff portion, and then when you open it up, like so, it should make a straight line. So let's go to our machine and join these three pieces, and then I'll be right back to show you how we're gonna press them for the double fold binding. Okay, so now we've sewn these two binding strips, and I am going to just snip them apart. And then you can either use scissors and just cut your triangles off. I often do scissors if I have a very long binding and I'm cutting a lot of pieces. Or you can, of course, use your ruler and rotary cutter and just line up that straight line with your 1/4 inch and cut it off. I usually leave a little more than a 1/4 inch. Not sure why, just habit. So either way, you're gonna trim your corner off, and then we're gonna grab our ironing board and iron, and we're gonna prepare the binding to be double fold. So here we have our seams. I like to press my seam open because this is gonna be on the edge, and it's going to take up less space if it's pressed open versus if it was pressed to one side. So let's grab our other seam as well, and then press this open also. Okay. And now, for what makes this double fold binding. So if this were a single fold binding, one, it wouldn't be this wide. But second, when we place it on our quilt, let me just grab my quilt for you. We would place our binding single fold, flat like this, and then sew it, and then it will wrap around. That's single fold binding. It would be narrower. That's how we do it. For double fold binding, we're just going to take our binding and fold it in half, and then press. Now this way there's going to be 2 layers of binding over the edge of your quilt. So double fold binding is really ideal for full quilts. Single fold binding is what I love to use for little projects like mug rugs and mini quilts and things like that, because those quilts aren't going to get a lot of use, and I think a single fold binding is nice and tidy on the edge of a little quilt. But when you have a big quilt, you're going to want that extra fabric so that your binding is going to be more sturdy. And then if you happen to get a little hole in your binding, you can mend it and it won't go all the way through to the edge of your quilt. So I am going to just keep pressing this the whole way down. And when you get to your fold, you can see by sewing that on the diagonal, let's press this and I'll show you, or not your fold, your seam. So by sewing it on the diagonal, my seam is actually wrapping in this big V shape. And so that's also going to reduce bulk on the edge of your quilt. And we're going to join our binding with a diagonal seam as well. All right, we're making it all the way to the end. Okay, so here we have our whole binding piece pressed in half. Gonna move our iron out of the way and grab our quilt. And you're gonna bind this quilt just the same way that you would bind any full-size quilt as well. It's just easier for me to show you on this little quilt. So we're gonna take our quilt and I'm gonna attach my binding to the right side of the quilt. You can attach your binding to the wrong side and fold it around to the right side. It's really personal preference. A lot of people prefer to attach their binding to the wrong side of the quilt, fold it around to the right side, and then they'll sew the right side with the machine. Then their right side is really nice and neat, and then it's just sewn onto the wrong side. I'm going to attach my binding by hand, so I prefer to attach it to the right side of the quilt and then flip it around and sew it by hand, which I'll be showing you. So what we're going to do is we're going to pin our binding or clip it just a little bit, just to give you the idea, and then I'm going to take you to the machine. So I'm going to demonstrate with clips. I'm just going to continue to place our binding around. And I'm going to demonstrate with clips once, and then I'm going to take you to the machine and show you a second time so that you can really get a clear understanding of how we're going to attach this binding, especially on the corners. So as we approach the corner of our quilt, we'll be sewing along at 1/4 inch, and we'll stop 1/4 inch before the edge of this quilt. So I'm just going to put a pin in at 1/4 inch, and I'll show you this on the machine. I'm just going to show you once before. And then you're going to fold your binding up at a 45-degree angle, so straight up, and then you're going to fold it back down, and you're going to start stitching and stitch the binding down. So like I said, I'll show you this with the machine, but this is what you're going to create on every corner, and then you're going to keep stitching and do it again on the next corner. So let's take this to the machine. I'll sew on this portion, and then I'll show you the corner one more time in detail on the machine. All right, let's head over there. Okay, so here we are at the sewing machine. We have our binding right up against the edge of our quilt, and I'm going to leave a nice long tail. That's going to make joining the binding easier. And then I'm just going to start sewing at 1/4 inch and go around my quilt. So I will stop and show you the corner in more detail when I get to the first one. Okay, so I'm approaching this corner and I'm gonna stop 1/4 inch before I reach the edge. This foot that I have, this red line, is actually 1/4 inch as well. So when the red line on my foot reaches the edge of my quilt, I'm going to cut my thread. And then I'm gonna pivot my fabric up at a 45-degree angle. This quilt happens to have a 45-degree angle right here, so that makes that nice and easy. So we're gonna pivot our fabric up and then back down our quilt. Just gonna use a clip on this edge so that I can turn it and show you. Okay, so then we're gonna turn our quilt because now we're going to quilt down the next side. So you can see I have my fold here twice, and then now my fabric is gonna go down the side of the next side of the quilt. So I'm gonna start sewing right here at the actual top of the quilt. So I'm gonna sew over that corner. And I love to backstitch a little bit here and just give that corner a little bit more sturdiness. And then we're gonna repeat just like we did previously, going straight down the edge of our quilt. Get this little clip out of the way. And we're just gonna sew down the length of our quilt until we get to the next binding, and then we'll repeat that flip on all of the corners. So I'm gonna sew this binding and then I will show you how to join the ends. All right, we've made it all the way around our quilt. So I'm going to backstitch and then cut my threads. And now you have this large-ish portion of your quilt that's unbound. So my binding does overlap. And I'm going to take this to the cutting table to show you exactly how we're going to pin it, and then we will come back to the sewing machine and sew that last portion together. Okay, so we have our joined piece of binding. I'm just going to use my scissors to snip this off. And then you can either use just a small section of your binding, or I'm going to use this whole last piece. So you're going to open this up, and this is 2.5 inches, and we're going to use this as a little measurement for how much we want our binding to overlap. So let's trim this end, and you could do this more precise with less waste, but I'm just going to do it just like this. And then we're going to overlap this one and then trim it so that it is exactly 2.5 inches. Sometimes I like to lay my binding on top, my extra piece, so that way when I lay this over, I know exactly where my cutting line should be. All right, so now your binding overlaps by 2.5 inches. And we're gonna open this up, and this is why it's nice to have a good size piece. So we're gonna open both of these up, and we're gonna cross them like so. Okay, and if you're not sure which way to cross, because sometimes it gets backwards, when you open your binding for your seam, it will lay flat. So let's cross these pieces, and I've got my pin handy. I'm going to pin them. Right here. And then I'm going to sew on the diagonal from edge to edge. And so when this folds up, you'll see this part is going to get cut off just like we did before. So let's fold this out now that we know we've done it the correct direction. And lay it out as flat as you can. I'm going to put a second pin on the side that we are going to not trim off. And then use my ruler. I know rulering over pins can be difficult, but we'll just use our ruler to draw this diagonal. So now we have this diagonal seam. I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew along this line, and then I'll bring it right back here to show you. Okay, so here you can see we've sewn across the diagonal of this, just like we did when we joined our fabrics. Now we'll take our pins out, and then I am going to trim just like I previously did. There we go. And then when you stretch your quilt out, look at that. It's gonna be the perfect amount. So we're gonna open it up, and I'm just gonna finger press this seam open. Of course, you could press it with your iron as well. And then fold again. And there you have your perfect diagonal seam. Then we're just going to take this back to our sewing machine and stitch along this edge as well. So I'm going to pin mine a little bit while it's nice and flat here, and then give it one quick press with my iron. And sometimes it's a little bunchy here. I often try to cut mine a hair smaller than the exact seam allowance, than the in this case 2.5 inches, just because then you don't get a pucker at all. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So let's just stitch this. I know this looks super crooked. It's because this is a wavy line quilting underneath. It's not because it's actually crooked. So I'm gonna press this and then take it over the sewing machine and sew that last bit. Okay, now we've sewn our last bit of binding, and what we're gonna do is wrap this binding now around to the back. So you can see our corners where we sewed them. They now make a perfect little mitered corner. So we're gonna flip our binding, push out gently those corners. And then we're gonna flip our binding over to the back. And this is where your binding clips will come in handy. So you can press your binding, and then you're just gonna overlap it to the back. If you wanna press it nice and small, since I'm using black, which in hindsight is probably not my best color choice for a video, but I am gonna pull my binding nice and snug. So let's grab our iron again, and we're gonna iron the binding on the front of our quilt. On a large quilt, I don't usually do this, but since this quilt is gonna be hanging on the wall and not used for a bed or cuddling on the couch or a picnic, I want the binding to be super neat and tidy. So I'm just gonna press it. And then when it comes to these, I just want my corners to be nice and neat. So I'm gonna press all the way around, and then we're gonna turn it to the back and gonna fold over, and this is where we're gonna use those wonder clips to hold the binding in place while we clip it, while we sew it. So I always just clip a few spots. You could clip your whole quilt if you want to. I usually just clip a few. And then let me show you how we're gonna handle the corner. And then I'll show you how to sew your binding. So you're gonna fold your corner down. Let's iron it. Okay, you're gonna fold your corner down and you're gonna clip it. All right, and so now we have this right here. is a 45-degree angle. I have another video that shows you how to put on these corners. So you can check the link in the description for that video if you're curious about these little blue polka dot spots. So then we're going to take our binding and fold it over again, and that's going to make our nice, neat, mitered corner on the back. And I like to put a clip on the corner and then one more right here. And this way, that nice point right there that we've made is going to stay put. And then you'll just want to add another clip or so down the line. And that is what's going to hold our binding in place while we stitch it. So let me get this ironing board out of the way, grab my needle and thread, and I'll show you how I'm going to hand stitch the binding to the back of my quilt. Okay, let's sew the binding on our quilt next. I'm going to be using some black RFL 50 weight thread. It's the same thread that I used to put the binding on my quilt. And some people like to bind with a single width of thread, but I prefer a double. So I'm just going to thread my needle. I'm using these Milner's needles. I don't know if you can see this, but these needles have a very tiny eye. And so it just glides through your fabric so easily. The eye isn't getting caught on anything. So I always wrap my thread around a few times for my knot. This is not necessarily maybe the most correct way to do a quilt, but this works for me. And then I always bind going towards the left. So we're just going to start by tucking in our thread tail and then folding over our binding. And remember, we pressed the binding really neatly. I'm going to steal a wonder clip from further down. I always like to have one clip before I start binding so that I know that my binding is nice and tight. And then I'm just going to take a tiny little edge of fabric and then go underneath for my quilt, grab a bit of my binding fabric and stitch. And then we're just going to keep on going down the quilt. So you can see that I've grabbed my fabric, gone under, and you will want to keep an eye on it because sometimes I accidentally stitch through both sides. So make sure your needle is just going under the back layer of fabric and not all the way through to the front, especially when using this dark thread and our front is this light fabric. And so you're just going to keep on stitching until you get to the end. When you need to add a new thread, you'll just tie this one off and add a new piece just like I added the first one. So I'll stitch this whole length of thread and then I'll add a new piece. You don't have to make your binding stitches too tiny either. They work great for a little bit bigger stitch will go faster on your quilt. Okay, so when we get to the corners, which we added in a different video, so when we get to our corners, I like to make sure I'm going all the way through the hanging corner and the back of the quilt, but not all the way through to the front, because that will just make sure that the dowel fits nice and snugly to the back of your quilt. And then when we get to the corner, we're just going to make sure that we stitch both those layers down. And then you'll just turn and keep on moving down your quilt. All right, we're getting right to the end of our thread. Okay, so this is how I like to knot my thread, and there's probably a correct way to do it, but this has worked for me for a very long time, so we're just going to go with it. So I make my stitch. This is going to be my last stitch. And then what I like to do is kind of lift up my fabric, move my needle over a bit, and then I'm going to pull my stitch tight, right? So my binding isn't going to have a loose portion. Hang on to that, grab another tiny little bit of thread, wrap my needle around a few times, and then I just pull it tight. Then I just walk my needle a little ways down. Oh, I grabbed the front. Did you see that? Grabbed the front right there. So I'm going to undo that. Make sure I don't grab the front. Pull my needle and then snip my thread, and then it will tuck in, and I'll just add a new thread and keep on going. So that's how I'm going to stitch the whole binding on this mini quilt. So let me move a couple things so I can turn it over and you can see how that's looking on the front. All right, so we could take these clips out because our binding is all neat and tidy in this section that I've sewn. And there you go. There is the binding on a mini quilt. So you'll just continue the process for stitching the whole quilt, and then you can use a dowel on your hanging sleeve from my other video and hang up your mini quilt. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy, and I would love to see you in my newsletter sometime in the future.